Richard, do central banks work the way they would have us believe in economic textbooks?
I don't think so. In fact, it's not just the economic textbooks which are often very wrong on central banks. It's really the central banker's own statements to the public which are very misleading. All of us got the impression over the last 30 years that really interest rates are the key tool they're using. And we know the story. When you lower interest rates, this will stimulate the economy. And when you raise rates, this will slow the economy. That's the story they're telling us. But that's not really true.
Now, here's one thing that I hear. Interest rates are the key variable for central banks. So if you want to slow an economy down, you raise rates. And if you want to boost, you lower rates. That's basically how I get it. But when you look at the empirical evidence, is that really how it works, though?
It cannot. It cannot be the way it works, because we know from the data that interest rates are actually lagging the economy. You can choose almost any country, and if you plot the nominal GDP growth rate against nominal interest rates, say a scatter plot, you will find a positive correlation. And if you do a time series where you see which one moves first, you see that it's really the economy that moves first and interest rates follow. So that means the central bank story is wrong in two dimensions. It's not a negative correlation, low rates and high growth going together, but it's positive, high growth and high rates. And secondly, the alleged causation doesn't run from interest rates to growth, but from growth to interest rates. Higher growth pushes up rates. Now, if that's true, and that is what the data are telling us on almost any country, any time period in the last 50 years when I checked, that means interest rates cannot be a key tool for monetary policy.
Now, back when you were at Jardine Fleming in the mid-1990s, you coined the term quantitative easing. We hear that term a lot today. Now, Richard, what is the quantitative easing that you described for Japan in the 1990s, and how does it differ from what is being dubbed as QE today?
Interest rates cannot be the key tool moving the economy. So then the next question is, what is really moving the economy? And I've examined central banks and their actions that we can measure and quantify using data. And what I find is that it is really the quantity of their credit creation and also their impact on the quantity of bank credit that makes that makes the difference, and that's really the key tool. So what's moving the economy is not the price of money, it's its quantity. That sounds quite monetarist, but it's measured differently from what the monetarists said. They looked at the official central bank money supply measures, M1, M2, M3, but these M's are really savings aggregates, money out of circulation. What's used for transactions can be measured through credit creation. So that's how we can measure central bank actions. And now that's the answer to your question. What did I say in the 90s, in the early 90s in Japan? In fact, my first forecast was in 1991. I just returned to the UK from Japan, and the stock market had fallen in 91. It peaked in December 1989, the famous bubble. The Nikkei was at 40,000 or 39,800. And then it started falling, but the economy was still going strong, 7% growth, interest rates were at 7%. So by 91, people were saying, well, the market's cheap now, the economy is still going strong, and look, the Bank of Japan is lowering interest rates for the first time, and they've got way to lower, so based on the official story, we should invest now in Japan. We should buy Japanese stocks, and that's what most strategists, forecasters were saying. But I was forecasting that actually the opposite would happen. Japanese banks were likely to go bankrupt, I was warning, and Japan was likely to move into the biggest recession since the Great Depression, because banks had created too much credit in the 80s. This was now turning into bad debts, which was going to destroy the banking system. Then you get a credit crunch and you get a recession. So your question was, well, how to get out of it, and what did I propose then? I was proposing a new type of monetary policy which doesn't fuff around with interest rates, because interest rates lowering interest rates cannot help. And I was warning that if you lower rates even to zero, which was quite a dramatic statement in 91, this couldn't stimulate the economy. Little did I know they wanted to prove me right on that one. What you need to do is expand the quantity of credit. And that was my definition of quantitative easing. I called it quantitative easing because it's, if you have a new policy, you need a new name. And it's defined as an expansion in the quantity of credit creation, ideally for GDP transactions. And there's various ways you can achieve that.
So is the ECB doing quantitative easing?
Unfortunately, not the type of quantitative easing I was recommending, and you will have noticed, and many of the viewers will have noticed, that Japan in the past 20 years has not actually recovered, and that's because they did not take my advice. The Bank of Japan agreed that a policy of quantitative easing should be tried after several years of denying that my proposal was sensible, but then it chose to do something quite different. They just called it quantitative easing. What they did is expand banks' reserves at the central bank. This is money the banks have at the central bank which cannot leave the central bank. It doesn't circulate in the economy. It's stuck at the central bank. Now, what good does that do the economy? Nothing. So I had warned actually already when I proposed the true quantitative easing, that type of monetarist narrow money expansion is not going to work. But unfortunately, that's what they tried, and they called it quantitative easing entirely misleadingly because there's already half a dozen names for that: reserve expansion, M0 expansion, high-powered money expansion, monetary base expansion. Why call that QE? You see, this is part of their strategy to obfuscate and confuse people. So they didn't do what I advised, and neither is the ECB taking my advice, and that's disappointing because I have visited them and I was presenting to around 40 of their very senior level staff, including deputy national bank governors at the ECB headquarters in Frankfurt. And they know my proposals, but unfortunately they've also not been interested in creating, it seems, a full-blown recovery, which you could easily do. What is the ECB doing? It is just increasing banks' reserves at the central bank, and the money that it's injecting is going entirely into financial markets. So we'll get more financial speculation, and the big banks will make money, and those ex-central bankers working at the big banks will do well. But the real economy will not really be positively affected. In fact, the main problem is that in the periphery, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, bank credit growth has been shrinking, and that is money creation. And so the money supply that's actually used for transactions has been shrinking. That's the problem. And I've got a number of proposals how to expand that and therefore get a recovery, but they haven't done any of those.
I mean, that's really concerning. Now, in the U.S. during QE1, Ben Bernanke said that the quantitative easing that the Federal Reserve was employing was really credit easing, basically meaning that the Fed was looking to step in as a lender of last resort in credit markets when banks couldn't. So was this closer to the QE that you envisioned?
Yes, I think Ben Bernanke was trying to make the point that his unconventional monetary policy, as they call it, is different from the Japanese-style QE. And what is the main difference? Well, what I proposed in Japan should be done to quickly reflate the economies. Basically, if you boil it down to the two most important policies, it's a two-step program. Number one, the central bank goes to the banks. And of course, the problem is the banks are not creating credit. Credit creation is shrinking, it's negative, because the banks have huge bad debts on their balance sheets. They don't know what to do. They're in trouble themselves. So the central bank says, okay, we'll clean up your balance sheets. And no, we don't want the taxpayer to have to pay for this, because the taxpayer is not responsible for this. The taxpayer didn't create those bad debts. In fact, we as the central bank, we're largely responsible. So we'll take care of this. There will be zero cost to the taxpayer, zero cost to society, zero new costs. The real costs, of course, were already in the past of this enormous resource misallocation. It would be silly to add new costs. So the central bank buys those non-performing assets from the banks, let's say at face value, which is of course much higher than the real market value. So the banks overnight are completely solvent, more flush and liquid, stronger balance sheets than ever before. So that's policy step number one. And the central bank just keeps it on its balance sheet, forget about it. It's not a problem. It's just a bookkeeping exercise. By the way, this can't create inflation because no money is injected into the non-banking sector as a result of this. But you are cleaning up the banks, and you're not burdening the taxpayer, and you're not creating a fiscal crisis like the ECB forced effectively on Ireland, Portugal, Greece by leaving these countries in the lurch, having created a huge credit bubble previously from 2004 to 2007, bank credit growth expanding between 25 and 40% year on year under ECB policies. And then when this bubble predictably burst, as I warned already in 2003, the central bank did not step in and clean it up at zero cost, which is what they could have done. They didn't, so governments had to do it, taxpayers have to pay, governments go bankrupt, then welfare payments and so on is being cut. So all this austerity is really a result of these ECB policy errors. So this can be done by the central bank, cleaning up the bank balance sheets at zero new cost to society. Step number two, you now need to expand bank credit in a way that is not just creating asset bubbles in the financial markets, but is actually boosting nominal GDP, because you want national income to grow. That generates jobs, it generates tax revenues, it helps to reduce your deficit GDP, debt GDP ratios, and that's what we need, and certainly in all these countries I mentioned. How can we do that? Well, there's an easy policy, and I hope many officials from finance ministries in the Eurozone are listening, or those who have contacts there, please tell them about this. I call it enhanced debt management, because the finance ministry, the treasury of any of the countries could do that by just stopping the issuance of government bonds. Don't issue bonds. So instead, how do you finance the government public sector borrowing requirement? Well, you enter into loan contracts with the banks in your country. So Spain would go to all the Spanish banks and borrow from them directly, not by issuing bonds, not through the bond markets. I mean, the bond underwriters will hate it. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and firms like that will not earn their underwriting fees. Often it's actually cheaper for governments because the interest rate in the credit market is lower than the bond yield, certainly in crisis moments. And then the banks, when they lend to the government, they are creating credit, because bank lending is where our money supply comes from in the system that we currently have. And therefore, the bank credit used for GDP transactions will rise, and this will create a recovery in nominal GDP, tax revenues, more jobs. You get a positive cycle, you get a recovery. So it can be simply done. Now, Bernanke did part one of this proposal that I put out in Japan in the 90s already. He bought the non-performing assets from the banks, and that helped the banks clean up the balance sheets very quickly, and they could lend. And now bank credit in America is growing. So what this shows is that if you do this step one very quickly, and Bernanke did it in September already starting, but September, October 2008. So very quickly. Then you may not even need step two, because the banks, the crisis doesn't really set in. You immediately, as a bank, you can lend again. You're quite happy to grow again. And that's what happened in America. So the American economy recovered and has been recovering since. Whereas in Europe, this has not happened. And in Japan, this has not happened because they didn't take step one. But now that in Europe we've had this contraction of credit for a few years, step one alone will not be enough. Just the central bank buying the bad debts from the banks won't be enough, but it certainly is very helpful. Number two, we must now increase bank credit by governments not issuing bonds anymore and borrowing from banks.
Now, Richard, since the central bank is targeting an interest rate, which is a price for reserves, if you will, is it basically compelled to supply all the reserves that banks want, essentially, in order to keep the rate at a target interest rate?
Well, yes and no. Because really you are using the sort of wrong type of analysis that central banks are putting out. I mean, yes, what you're saying is, of course, what we hear from the central banks, but that's not really how things work. because when do central banks set a different interest rate? And, they say we're targeting them, but, whatever they do, whether they lower them or they raise them, these interest rates, they follow the economy. So when you get higher growth, they will start to raise those short rates. When they lower them, it's because the economy has been slowing. So it is really looking at the economy through the rear mirror only. And perhaps the other point we should remember is that no matter what happens to these reserves that banks have at the central bank, whether the central bank is supplying more or not, doesn't directly help the economy. It may help the banks, but it doesn't directly help the economy because these reserves cannot be lent out by the banks. They don't leave the central bank balance sheet. They stay on the central bank balance sheet. So this is really money to play with in financial markets by financial institutions. And that tends to be connected with asset inflation, but that's not really helping us very much. So we need to move away from the focus on reserves. They're really a sideshow. Reserve money is not really, it's less than 3% of the money supply. 97% of the money supply is bank credit created by banks through extending loans. That's the money supply, and that's really what central banks need to look at. And of course, they are very much aware of that, but they're not always taking the policies needed to expand bank credit.
The conventional monetarist policy prescription of expanding the base money supply, that it's flawed. So is that because credit expansion is the issue?
Yes, that would be a short answer, absolutely. What's driving nominal GDP is bank credit creation for GDP transactions. I proposed this already over 20 years ago. It's called the quantity theory of credit. And what's driving the economy and asset prices is credit creation, because that's the real money supply, bank credit creation. But you need to separate it into two streams, because different type of credit will have a different type of impact. Bank credit that is lent to borrowers that will use it in the economy, say business investment or even consumption, that will drive nominal GDP. But if you extend bank credit for financial transaction, in other words, for purchases of ownership rights, financial assets, real assets, this will affect asset prices, but it will not affect GDP. Asset transactions, property transactions, financial transactions, they're not part of GDP. They don't contribute to GDP. But they will, of course, this bank credit for those transactions, that will affect asset prices. So by disaggregating credit into these two streams, we already can identify times and sources of credit, financial booms, asset booms driven by bank credit. So they're always driven by bank credit. And then we can forecast nominal GDP by looking at the bank credit that's used for GDP transactions. Now, there we can further disaggregate. If banks lend for consumption, you can expect consumer price inflation. But if banks mainly lend to companies that invest in the expansion of their equipment to produce more goods and services, you will get non-inflationary growth, and that is the growth that is also sustainable. Then you're not going to have a banking crisis. If that's the main reason why bank credit is expanding, business investment, you're not going to have a banking crisis, because these are projects that have a chance of delivering income streams to service and repay the principal, and they contribute to GDP, which is why they're in the national income accounts in GDP. But if banks mainly lend for financial transactions, that at best creates capital gains, but they're contingent on ever rising credit creation to push up further those asset prices.
So Richard,
in other words, Ponzi schemes.
I've had three market monetarists on this show, David Beckworth, Scott Sumner, and Nick Rowe, who have all been advocates of targeting nominal economic growth targets instead of interest rates. So what's your view on nominal GDP targeting for central banks?
Yeah, that's very sensible. I've been advocating that also for 20 years. Effectively, central banks are doing that. They just don't want to admit it, because if they admitted that, it would be clear that they've been planning boom-bust cycles. So, of course, central banks know they have to look at nominal GDP. but we have to force them to really adopt that as a formal framework. And how do you target nominal GDP? How can you achieve a set nominal GDP growth target? Very easy. Bank credit creation for GDP transactions. The way this has been done for many decades in East Asia very successfully has been, so say in Japan or in Taiwan or Korea or China indeed, the government or the central bank would set a desired nominal GDP growth rate. So say in Japan, let's say 4 or 5%. They would then calculate what sort of bank credit growth would be needed for GDP transactions. For that, they would suppress bank credit for financial speculation because that's dangerous, unsustainable, increases inequality and creates problems. And they would also not encourage consumer credit very much because it becomes unsustainable. And you have to ensure that people have enough incomes so that they don't have to go into debt. And so, so this bank credit for productive purposes, GDP transactions, will be encouraged and set in line with the GDP growth targets. And then you get to your nominal GDP. It's very easy. This is a system of credit guidance which was run very successfully in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China. But also many European economies have adopted that in the past. I mean, it was originally pioneered in Germany by the Reichsbank 100 years ago.